Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name's Alex Bell, and I'm the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. We're bringing you back another live event driven by the pages of our magazine, which brings you cutting edge insights on global risks on a bi monthly basis. So if you aren't yet a subscriber, we will have a link for you in the chat. The theme of the current issue is disinformation as an existential risk multiplier. Our conversation today will explore how the very nature of information and knowledge is being directly impacted by the rise of artificial intelligence. Using AI, of course, still in the early days, but in many fields, it's already causing mass disruption. From the media industry, where journalists are being replaced by LLMs, to the field of academia, where worrying signs of AI reliance are being found, we are in a moment where societal norms of information and expertise are already fracturing. This discussion is brought to you with the support of the Future of Life Institute. We thank FLI for helping us to explore the important topics surrounding the development of AI and its incorporation into our daily lives. For today's conversation, we've invited two important voices to help us understand just who is relying on this technology and what it might mean for society. First, joining us today is Dr. Joan Donovan, an assistant professor of journalism and emerging media studies at Boston University. Joan focuses on media manipulation, the sociology of knowledge and expertise, and networked social movements. She co-authored Meme Wars, the untold story of online battles upending democracy in America. And previously, she was a research director at the Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. Next, we have Andrew Gray. Andrew is a librarian at University College London, where he specializes in bibliometric tools and methods. In 2024, he published some of the first analysis indicating the widespread use of undisclosed AI tools in published research. He also has an article in the current issue of Bulletins magazine covering growing AI usage in scholarly publishing and what that might mean for academia going forward. So we'll link to that article in the chat. Joan and Andrew, thank you so much for being here. For all of you watching, we're going to be taking questions from YouTube throughout the next 45 minutes. So please do type your questions in and we'll get to as many as we can. So let's set the basic foundation. Can you both briefly describe why it is important to have trusted and healthy media and academic sectors when it comes to managing challenges like existential risks? Joan, let's start with you.
Hey, everybody, and thank you, Alexandra, for the introduction and for the bulletin to have us today. I really appreciate the attention to the issue, and I've been on this beat or in this field for, sadly, over a decade now. I first started looking at medical misinformation and genetic ancestry tests, like what is the actual thing that these companies are selling, and then looking at deeply how white supremacists were using DNA ancestry tests as another version of the one drop rule. So I've been thinking a lot about scientific misinformation, medical misinformation my entire career. And I think right now we've reached a really important pivot point where maybe we would call it a dead reckoning, where we know that the direction that we pick in the next couple of years is going to be very determinant for a range of institutions, not just science and technology. But right now, the way that AI is being quite literally evangelized, not quite sold, is alarming. And our colleagues are falling into this trap as educators. Our students are double diving into it because they are afraid if they miss the boat on AI, there'll never be a future. But I'll just close my opening remarks with saying I went through this as a graduate student where in 2011, if you had asked people if you could have democracy without Facebook, they would have said no way. The internet and social media gives us voice. And it's always been troubling to me as a communication scholar and a sociologist that people feel so disenfranchised by the political system that they would mistake this kind of commercialized speech for freedom. And so my career has been looking at disinformation from a critical lens, trying to understand the tools, tactics, and even territories in which disinformers create their campaigns and then have a clearly very outsized impact on society. If we look at the current framing of our politics and the current framing of our technology, and then the ownership, who owns these platforms, and quite frankly, I think that when you have billionaires owning most of the communication systems, and they're interested political actors, they're not disinterested like scientists are supposed to be. That creates a perfect storm for oppression and suppression of information.
Thanks for that sobering analysis, Joan. Andrew, your thoughts on this?
My thoughts are, I agree with everything I've just heard. I think the terms that have just that I just wanted to pick up on there are evangelism, and I think this we are really seeing these tools being massively evangelized, and it's quite astonishing just how much we are told continually these things are the future, these things are perfect, these things are wonderful, and those of us actually grappling with them are saying, well, they're not. They're really not. So from my perspective, I look at studying the scholarly publications, scholarly output, the 5 million research papers a year that help decide what we do in the world, because we say science is good, science tells us useful things. And for years, those have maybe been a tempting target for misinformation and disinformation, but they've never really been horrendously, they've been vulnerable to it, but they've never been suffering from it in a way that it's not been endemic, it's not been widespread, it's not been shaking the foundations of the entire system. And what we're seeing with the growth of AI, and we'll talk about this a bit more later on, I think, is that, to pick up on the other phrase that Joan used, it's a perfect storm. We're seeing that these tools are making it so much easier to produce misinformation, whether that be intentional misinformation, whether that be what you might call well-meaning but faulty misinformation. They're making it so much easier to produce that at great scale. They're making it so much easier to make that look and sound convincing. And they're making it so much easier to try and overwhelm the existing systems we have within scholarly publishing, but also within journalism, within the public sphere, because we have so much of our trust is based on that sounds authoritative, that sounds respectable, that's gone through a publishing process we recognize. And as those start to falter, those start to be overwhelmed by a tide of new material that looks and sounds convincing, it makes it so much easier to insert misinformation into there. So I think we are, as Joan says, very much at this dangerous inflection point. The level of problematic material is rising in all sorts of fields. The motives behind it may not always be clear, but even material that's being produced with maybe not actively bad motives, maybe simply small-scale self-serving motives, can still pose a problem for trust, for integrity, and for the perception of trust, which I think is something that is quite important to talk about. There's been a lot of very interesting work done that I think, again, we'll talk about later, about how people respond to stuff that they know is AI generated or they suspect is AI generated by very reasonably being less trusting of it.
Yeah, thank you for the framing from both of you. I think let's drill down a little bit about each of your sectors and how AI is affecting them. Andrew, let's start with your article. Can you talk a little bit about how you started to find undisclosed AI usage in academic papers and talk about the widespread nature of it?
Yeah, so this actually came out of one of those things that just does the rounds on Twitter, or possibly it was on Blue Sky because it was a couple of years ago, that is just funny, and then you dig into it and it starts being alarming. So people were finding a couple of cases, I'd say a couple, there was maybe 10 of them across a year, where someone had published a paper that was obviously written by ChatGPT to the point that it included, like, please regenerate this response, or I'm sorry, as a large language model, I can't tell you that. And that was actually stuck in the abstract or halfway through the text. It's marvelous. You just look at them, it's, oh no. And, I was just chatting about this to a colleague, we were quite amused by it, and I was curious to see if you could find more of these phrases. So I started looking in the databases to see if we could find more examples using these phrases. And we could find half a dozen. And I was like, okay, this isn't really a big problem, let's not worry about that. And then at the same time, someone published a paper that said they'd started seeing signs of AI in peer review in conferences. So, especially in computer science, the practice in that field is that most publication is done through the medium of conferences. You submit your papers to the conference, they're peer reviewed by members of the conference panel or by other people who say, this sounds like great work, let's put this in the conference, or this doesn't sound very interesting, let's knock it back. And they noticed that a lot of these suddenly sounded ChatGPT generated, or other tools are available. And one of the things they mentioned in this was, here's half a dozen words that we found were really, really common. And I then looked for those words. And it turns out that overnight in 2023, 2024, the frequency of these words in published papers just went through the roof. Little hockey stick graph going right up. They would be found in some tiny percentage of papers. They'd suddenly be found in 10, 20, 30 times more, especially in combinations. There were 3-word phrases that never appeared before 2022 and suddenly are starting to show up. So these distinctive writing patterns showed up in the papers. And this is really, really straightforward work. You could, and I did, just do it on an evening just by plugging words into a database. There have been other much more sophisticated analysis than mine, using much more complex methods. They found much the same thing. These indicative features are going up and up and up. And this was published in about 2 years ago, April 2024. There's a bit of discussion about it at the time. And then something very interesting happened, which is a year later, we looked back at what had happened in 2024, and someone found that most of those words that we thought were distinctive ChatGPT or other AI markers stopped being used. People loved the word, delve. They loved intricate. They stopped using delve. They stopped using intricate. Those words went back to their baseline. But other words, which had not been highlighted in the reporting, continued on the same trajectory. So what we were seeing was evidence both that the level of usage continued to grow unabated and very significantly unabated, but also that people were actively doing something to try and conceal it. And this was the point at which really alarm bells started ringing for me, because something's not great about that. Because there was a lot of discussion in the profession, in the publishers. Do we ask people to disclose this? Yes, we do. Do they disclose it? No, they don't. So we're at this point where we know people are using these tools, but we know they're not telling us they're using these tools, and they're actively trying to hide using these tools. And that's not good. That's not something that fills you with a great deal of confidence about what the reasoning is, what the motives are, and so on. Sorry, I've gone a little bit on a tangent there.
No. It's fascinating and also terrifying.
It is terrifying.
Joan, have you been seeing the same thing in the media space? A slow adoption of AI tools, of LLMs, and what is it doing to the fourth estate?
Yeah, it's complicated. I think, part and parcel of the issue is the actual history of journalism, right? Is that, social media comes on the scene and not being a very good partner to journalism in the beginning, and journalism not being a very good partner to social media either, because not a lot of newspapers at the beginning saw the opportunity of the web in the same way. But now things have changed. People go predominantly to social media for news and information, entertainment. News finds them, which is something that Pew has been showing, is that people often will get small, quirky, novel, outrageous stories, but they don't get in-depth investigative reporting, very unlikely to be shared, usually behind a paywall. And so you have this two-tier information system playing out online where everything that is free gets circulated at higher volumes than everything that is expensive. But we know that information is fast and free, knowledge is slow and expensive. And so, in a lot of ways, thanks to people like Andrew, we're really trying to catch up on what's been happening. So within newsrooms, there's been an enormous effort to integrate AI into the reporting cycles. It's been a disaster. People don't want to read journalists that don't exist. People don't want information that isn't true. And so you really do run a risk as a news organization integrating AI, because you will eventually end up with one of these headlines that AI does something dumb, and now it's your responsibility. And what's hard about journalism is it is a craft. It is not just a profession, it is craft work. It requires, I tell my students all the time, because I teach journalism and disinformation, is that like what sets them apart is their voice and their ability to articulate ideas, their ability to ask questions on the spot. And that requires you to know your field and your beat inside and out. And so we work a lot on that in at BU with our journalism students. And so it's starting to become less of a problem for certain professors and more of a problem for others. So if you're a professor like me and you know how large language models work and you can explain it to the students that at best they're moving to the mediocre middle, like large language models are an average of things. So it's like you get the average of what people might be interested in. There's a great website that actually measures and looks at the biases within ChatGPT called inequalities.ai. And it shows you that baked into these models are opinions embedded in code. The other thing that we know, and that once you explain it, especially to students that are obsessed with accuracy, is that AI, large language models, will always introduce errors. And it's an artifact of how they're trained, in one instance, but it's also part of the way in which the architecture works. And so there's actually no getting around that AI will produce unsourced, unvetted information. And not, it's a popular trope that it's just to please you. And in some capacities, certain AI models, yes, they are sycophantic and are looking just to please you. But I think as you start to look around what we might call our truth-telling institutions, you're starting to see a bit of a revolt against integration of at least large language models. I think where the panic around AI is most appropriate, and this is the field that's ringing the alarm bells, is computer programming. I mean, it's large language models are highly structured models of highly structured information, and that's what code is. And so on the one hand, if you think about what's happening in computer science, it truly is a revolution. But if you apply that same logic to sociology or PhDs in the humanities, it's just like no matter how fast a horse runs, it's not going to become a locomotive, right? Like it doesn't make sense that these things will give birth to artificial human-like general intelligence, just by the way they're constructed. And so if you can convey that to young people, to students, to executives, they start to look at it less like a magic bullet for all that ails them. Um, and I think media, especially journalism as an art and a craft, has been under attack for so long and hasn't been able to figure out a secondary revenue stream that is as powerful and as mighty as advertising. And so, I think my generation maybe be the last generation of folks that were, um, in some ways, the side effect of advertising was that we had more facts in the world because they were supporting reputable outlets. But now, without that cash infusion and without the desire to tell the truth or the need to tell the truth or the need to be accurate, what you get in is these stand-ins like Sam Altman, who will tell you ChatGPT is everything for everyone and more. And in a year, it'll be a kitchen timer, right? And those are the examples they give you. And so I'll end with saying, I always tell my students, never trust a man without a product plan, right? If you're going to implement something into your business, you want to know exactly what it does and how it breaks. Because if it's expensive to fix what breaks, you don't buy that machine, right? So in the same way that you would purchase machinery for your factory or for your construction company or for your dentist office, is the same way you got to vet these other systems.
So Andrew, Joan talked a little bit about this atrophy of skills and how reliance on these tools can actually undermine the overall basis of knowledge. So how are students and young professionals going to develop skills necessary to sort of innovate to create if they're secretly crutching with AI tools? And we got a question from YouTube. In this way, are students and teachers being held to different standards of use of AI, and how does it affect both sides of the academic coin, the instructors and the instructees?
Sorry, I'm just scribbling that down. Are students and teachers being held to different standards? I think, yes, they are, but by virtue of the fact that students are being held to some standards and the academics, they're not really in many ways. When we look at researchers, we sort of ask them not to do it, but it's very much up to them if they, most publishers will say, well, disclose it if you've used it substantially, but the decision on what makes it substantial is up to you, and disclosing it's up to you. So um, the atrophy of skills is something that I do wonder about. There's a very compelling analogy that I've seen discussed, which is people will say, this is exactly what happened a couple of generations ago, a generation ago, when they were saying you can't, why are we teaching children arithmetic? We're giving them calculators. They'll always have a calculator to hand. We've got one on our phones now, which we definitely didn't have in the 80s, but we always expected to have a pocket calculator somewhere. And it's being able to tease that apart, I think. So there was a paper I looked at recently, which did a bit of work on this, which was saying I thought was a very compelling argument that when we give a child a calculator, the child doesn't know how to do arithmetic. There's basically nothing you can do on a calculator that you or I couldn't do if we sat down with a big enough sheet of paper and a pen. We could multiply two 16-digit numbers together. We could find a square root of it. We could get there eventually. It might take us a lot of cups of coffee and a lot of swearing and a few errors on the way, but we'd get there. We know basically what this tool is doing, and we have an idea of what the expected outcome from that tool is. But LLMs don't necessarily work that way because they've got this quite low barrier to entry for quite a complex output. You can ask an LLM to generate you an entire bit of code without really knowing how the code works. I've done this myself. I can see that I need a bit of Python to do this. I can't get there, but I can get an LLM to generate it for me. It's great. That's the thing it works for. But I can't debug it because I don't know enough to debug it. Similarly, I can ask an LLM to write me, 4,000 words on something that I don't really understand. I can get something, but if that LLM breaks down, if it goes away, if it starts giving weird results, if it turns out to suddenly be incredibly racist and not useful for writing my essays anymore, which might well happen one day, who knows? Or in one option that we're seeing start becoming a possibility, it stops being free. A lot of these tools are fundamentally run as loss leaders. They're computationally incredibly expensive. They're relying on a very large amount of hardware, of computing power, of resources, and we're giving that to people for $10 a month when maybe the real cost is hundreds. And when the companies suddenly realize we actually have to start charging hundreds for this, a lot of people are not going to have access to these tools anymore, but they've got themselves in a position where they think they can do all these things. The analogy, the paper I was reading again used the phrase sort of, you can become unconsciously competent. You can do a skill without knowing how to do it because you've got your tool, you've got your calculator, you've got your LLM. But if it goes away again, you might suddenly just become completely unaware. You don't have these skills to try and make up for what you are missing from what you used to have from that LLM. And I know that when I I don't teach myself, so I can't speak as well as someone like Joan can to this. But a lot of the initial uses of LLMs were students wanting to automate things like write an essay. And of course, the goal of writing an essay is not to produce the essay, it's to make you think about what's going into it. Um, and we're we're letting people skip over the thinking part, which is of course the concern. And
Yeah,
the earlier, sorry.
oh, I would want to jump in on that because it's such an important point in class that now the students before couldn't understand why I had them read each other's work. But now they get it because like all of a sudden they're on the lookout for AI in other people's writing and things. So it's actually like in the classroom now, students are really in interesting ways, both trying to like accommodate and learn these tools and do the cognitive offloading that you're talking about, Andrew, around all of the skill sets that you learn by writing a paper. And I always explain to my students, like, sitting down to grade 60 papers is like eating a lot of cold pizza. It's like, and it should be because it can't be the best pizza I've ever had because you're in class. And if it is the best thing I've ever had, you're either Goodwill Hunting or like something happened here. And like, and sadly, I've had to fail a couple of students that are wonderful, thoughtful people, but they just thought they could run it through a large language model. And they didn't understand that even in summary, a large language model might pick up the wrong context. And, because the paragraph before that, says the next paragraph is a quote from a person I don't believe in. And then it comes up in the summary that the whole paper is about that quote or something. Like
Mm,
the students don't get all the levels of nuance that what it means to be a scholar is actually to be in a field, know who those people are in the field that are your colleagues that you go to conferences with. And like a lit review should be like a love letter to the field, right? Of course, you got to critique one or two things that are out there that your ideas push back against. But for the most part, like it's a celebration of knowledge when you're publishing and doing this work. So I try to inculcate in my students that like at the status that they are, if they're not bad, they're not learning. Like, so why take the course, right? It's like the Spanish student that comes to America and takes the Spanish classes to get the credits. It's like, I get it, but also, what are you learning? The other
mm,
thing I'll say about your point, Andrew, about where the field is going in AI around, vibe coding and people just making up their own code. Everyone I know that's a senior engineer right now is going into security of AI. It's like the most clear line of profit is fixing bad code now. And so you start to see these emergent industries start in the profession start to change as
mm.
the material changes. And it's been interesting to watch. And I don't even know if people are really tapped into that trajectory or if they're looking that closely at it.
Hmm. Yeah, and so we're talking about the bad information
Mm.
that AI can produce, just as a nature of how these LLMs work and misinterpret and summarize in sort of facile ways. But let's talk about how AI can be a tool for disinformation in these two spaces. Should we be concerned about active AI-based disinformation campaigns? In the media, I think the answer is clearly yes, but in academia, maybe people don't understand the problem it can present. But I think the speed and the volume of the way that disinformation can be spread now, even exacerbated through AI tools, has effects on academia that we may not have even started to think about. But let's start with the media place, where I think we clearly can see the danger coming. Joan,
Yeah,
what
I
does
think
it look like and will it get worse?
yeah, so I think the main problem right now is that we've shifted from going in 2015, 2016, where you had a lot of trolls and unaffiliated propaganda to a full scale information war that's being played out on all of these social media platforms. And AI is just another arrow in the arsenal of what's happening, and especially around media. We have the White House posting deepfakes of people, just small changes, like a woman that was being arrested who was defiant in her picture. The government, the White House changed it so that she was crying in the picture. Subtle things like that, right, are really important signals that the things that we being asked to report on as a media are things that are entirely being fabricated in order to get the media covering the wrong things, or what Steve Bannon called it as a strategy, quote unquote, flooding the zone with shit. And I think when Steve Bannon was really learning about media manipulation, and this is chronicled in our book, Meme Wars, is he's actually back during the Occupy movement in 2011 doing a documentary with Andrew Breitbart about the Occupy movement and Anonymous. And as you start to look at Steve Bannon's career over the years, first it was Anonymous, then it was Black Lives Matter, then it was Antifa. And so the way in which Bannon and others have been able to utilize disinformation, and then also weaponize social media platforms has been going on now for at least 15 years, right? And so at this point, on social media, especially in the midst of um, war in Ukraine, war in the Middle East, in Gaza, Lebanon, Iran. There's a lot that is on offer in terms of what we would call white propaganda, which is propaganda that we kind of know where it's coming from, like the Lego deep fakes about, that Iran, supposedly Iran is putting out. It looks to be like it's a media company that's making these videos that are then being circulated by different political accounts. So I do think that there's a deepening weaponization of social media that AI has really given a new set of tools to, especially when it comes to things like harassment and incitement. And that's kind of felt like day old bread for a while now. I mean, we've had the disinformation problem for
Mm.
at least at this scale for quite a while. We just haven't had it as fully fledged integrated into our political apparatus as we do now. Which is to say that if we don't have accountability when it comes to our political appointees, then the rot is just going to become part of the system, right?
Yeah.
If we don't see anybody being held accountable, like someone like Elon Musk, who's allowed Grok to quote unquote nudify children, um, we have to be wary that these are all part and parcel of the same system. And I would say that the last thing I'll say about part and parcel of the system is that it's getting more personal. It's getting more preferential. It's AI is most persuasive when it's read your posting history. So there's been a couple of things that have happened online. One experiment explicitly that was carried out on Reddit without Reddit's knowledge, where an AI chatbot read your posting history and then tried to persuade you to change your mind. And those who were experimented on changed their mind 6 times more likely if AI was being used against them.
Hmm.
So we know now that these are very powerful persuasive systems, as well as, they can create dancing fruit that goes on dates with each other, right? And so it's like trying to hold in your mind that it's the same thing that does these two things is particularly mind-blowing, I think, for a lot of journalists who are confronted with having to describe these systems in both their absurdity, but then also in their dangers.
Okay. I'm going to come back to potential what do we do about that in the
Yeah.
media space? I want Andrew though to talk about disinformation in active disinformation in academia.
Well, the good news is, compared to what Jones just described, it's practically paradise. It's things are so much less bad. I'm not saying they're great. I'm saying they're so much less bad. So, in terms of active disinformation, there's always been this background pressure for people to publish fraudulent work in research and science. And sometimes this is because they want to sell new pills. Sometimes this is because they have more political motives at hand. You can imagine around climate change, for example, there's big pressures to publish material that is a bit dubious. And the analogy that again I use in the paper is the immune system has been built up over the years of saying, well, that's not actually very good research. That's problematic. A lot of bad stuff has always slipped through, but it's never been at a level to threaten the integrity of the entire system in the way that is happening. I think Jonas compellingly said is happening to social media. It's still there. It's there if you were to look for it, but it's not rampant in the same way. But the threats that AI bring is firstly that it makes it so much easier to do that. You can produce 1,000 compelling sounding papers making your points because it's now so much easier to produce papers that, the barrier to entry to generating things that are wrong is much easier. You press a button and do it. You can generate 1,000 of them overnight. It's also threatened by the rise generally in volume driven by AI material. Before we start the session today, Joan and I were both exchanging notes on having, the number of papers that we hear about coming up that are just junk really being submitted because it's so much easier to produce them now. And so it's easier to try and slip things through because you can generate 1,000 things and fire them off, and maybe one of them will stick. Who knows? But the system is also, in some ways, putting itself a bit at risk because we know that a lot more material is now AI assisted. I wouldn't say AI generated, but AI assisted. Problem is, of course, that AI assisted, be it polishing or translating or copy editing, looks quite hard to distinguish from generated unless you start digging into it in great detail. We know that people are much less willing to trust material that they perceive as AI generated, that sounds AI generated, that looks AI generated, or that they have reason to believe is AI generated. And so we've got this situation where more and more papers are coming out that are AI involved in some way. We know that a lot of these are on topics that the paper itself might be right, but the topic is very contentious. It's essentially giving ammunition to people who want to try and discredit it. It's providing people with a very easy way of saying, oh, all that's rubbish anyway. Those papers are telling you to get vaccinated, but AI just generated them all. Even if they didn't, it's that additional thing to it's assisting the people who want to sow distrust in it. And in some ways, it's assisting it through its own actions. The system we have, where people essentially papers are a form of currency, citations are a form of currency, encourages people to submit as much as possible, to do so as quickly as possible. That is essentially an economic pressure to use these tools to make your writing faster. We know that authors who use AI tools produce papers faster. And so there's all these incentives to keep doing it. And yet those are the things that put the whole system so much more at risk. There is a famous bit of doggerel from the 1930s, I think Hilaire Belloc, in which he says, one simply cannot bribe or twist, thank God, a British journalist. But seeing what the man will do unbribed, we've got no reason to. If they're going to do this stuff anyway, why bother trying to make the things worse? We can take advantage of it.
I
Thank you
guess
for that.
I would like to add just a little bit about the pandemic context that landed us here, because what Andrew's also pointing to is right before we had we had large language models at our disposal. We also were dealing with an academic crisis around preprints, right? So this idea that COVID was so new that anything that came out in a preprint archive was considered leading science. And that was routinely taken advantage of by literally Bitcoin enthusiasts who had gone out and claimed that hydroxychloroquine was a secret COVID slayer. And, people started taking that drug in massive quantities. There was a shortage of it. And then when you get right down to it, it was a Google Doc that was being shared that included a bunch of doctors' names that had never agreed to be part of the paper to begin with. And so we had been suffering from a bit of a scientific literacy conundrum right prior to this double whammy of generative AI getting on the scene. And just to be clear with people, we're not saying that like if you're on Microsoft Word and it suggests that your grammar is out of order, that we would call assistive AI. This is when the AI is producing ideas as well as text and
Yeah.
it even producing citations, which has become a huge problem within the legal field where so many briefs are being produced with false citations now that there's a bit of a bounty on the head of lawyers that are doing this.
Yeah, so let me shift us. We've got a little bit of time left about what we do about all of this. The outlining of the scope of the threats here, I think, is clear. But what do we do? Dr. Donovan, actually, we got a question. You said that people want the truth when they read the news, and the question was, how do they get material that is true? How do people know that material is true? uh, with so much disinformation online. So I guess,
Mm.
your advice for digital literacy, and then Andrew, will come to you on just sort of how do academics, build a regulatory structure. This is not a brief question answer, I know, but
Yeah.
how do academics start to build a structure that would help manage these changes? So Joan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that when people are seeking the news, they're looking for what I call talk, timely, accurate local knowledge. And I say knowledge instead of information because it means that the information that you're getting has been vetted in some way and that there are multiple sources for it. So when people are seeking out talk, they should know that there are different rules for different distribution systems. So newspapers have a lot of rules against defamation and inappropriate, they even have inappropriate claims. They even have entire, squads of fact checkers and editorial, which does tend to lessen the um the disinformation that gets through. It doesn't erase all of it, but we've been working very hard to train up working journalists over the years that can spot media manipulation, disinformation, and understand their role in spreading it, because journalists unfortunately get squeezed in this paradox of needing to be fast and accurate. That's the ultimate trade that Andrew and I are discussing today is with you, Alexandra, is that the trade-off of speed and accuracy have always been something journalism has had to negotiate. And so for the readers and listeners of the bulletin, I'd say, you're in the right place. You're reading things that people want to have discussions about in a way that is fact-based. So forums like this, local news on television, is also a great source of information. It's not the best source, but it helps because local news on TV is going to be event-based analysis of what's happening in your community. It might not get into all of the ins and outs of global politics, but it'll at least let you know in your town what's at stake. The other thing I would say for parents in particular is we're now starting to see the results of give a child a computer education, right? Like I got a computer when I was 18, but a lot of younger people are raised in this environment of talking to screens rather than turning to their neighbor. And I see younger parents that were raised in that rejecting it now. They want their children to be away from screens. They don't want AI implemented in high schools. And so I think that parents are really at the forefront of learning from their own experience. They're in their 40s now. They've got a kid that maybe is a teenager that is experiencing a lot of pressure, being connected all the time can have that effect on you. And so I do think it's important that get your news from a place you know about and that is reputable in your community. Participate with others in your generation towards cleaning up this information ecosystem that's become so overly polluted by ultimately what's a problem of like a very small group of people at the top that are forcing this our into our world in ways, and I'm saying it as in disinformation, that are forcing it into our worlds in ways that require us to confront it, but we don't have to spend so much energy on it,
Yeah. Thanks for
unfortunately.
that.
Mhm.
Yeah, Andrew, will you wrap us up?
Yeah, so I've just been, while John was speaking there, I was just thinking about how can we try and regulate these things ourselves. And certainly within academia and from the teaching side, I think what Joan was saying there about younger people often reacting against a very technology-heavy upbringing, there are a lot of people who are, undergraduate students now, who are doctoral students now, who are saying, actually, no, we shouldn't be. We want to do things that aren't, committing everything to AI. We want to do things in a more thoughtful, more sensible fashion, and that's great. It's good to see that response. Within academia on the research side, I think the answer is really going to be self-regulation in many ways. Academia has been self-regulated for a very long time, and we've developed ways. Papers are peer-reviewed, they're reviewed by other academics, they're edited by academics mainly. Um, the norms around disclosing conflict of interest, around disclosing funding, that sort of thing, those have all emerged from within the publishing system. They've not been legislated on. They've been the community itself saying we need to do better on this, and making steps to do that. Other norms around what you disclose, what you provide, they've all developed. And I think if the community wants to, it can establish these norms saying, this is what we think appropriate AI use is. This is how we're going to, we as publishers are going to do that. And we're going to teach our colleagues, teach our graduate students, this is the way going forward that we want to do it. But whether we can, that's the question.
Yeah, no, that's a good note to end on. And I think, sort of understanding the problem, identifying the problem is the first step towards finding solutions. So lots of work to be done, to be sure. That's all the time we have today. Thank you very much to Joan and Andrew for a fascinating discussion on a very serious challenge in both the media landscape and the academic landscape. And look forward to future conversations about how we manage these challenges. Thanks again to the Future of Life Institute for sponsoring this event. And we'll have another online event in May. But if you are in New York next week, April 28th, please consider joining the Bulletin at a screening of the documentary Bombshell, which will be held at the Museum of Arts and Design in New York City. And that event is going to be brought to you with the partnership of the Developing Story Project, the Stanley Center for Peace and Security, and Fordham University's Department of Communication and Media Studies. Again, that information is on our website. And thank you all for tuning in. We hope to see you soon.